Okay, so the first section that we're going to look at in this class is going to be about European state building in the 1600s. Now, technically this class starts in 1660 onward to the present day, but some events are going to happen a little bit before 1660, but roughly around 1660 all the way forward. In this case, we're looking at state building in Europe from 1618 roughly to about 1715. Now there's going to be a new concept, or political concept as it were. This first section is going to be largely political, and that's the nature of state building in itself, but what they call it is absolutism. Now we'll get to what absolutism is here in a second, but first, one of the questions is, why does this happen now? Why does this political movement gain ground, become popular in Europe? Now, the reason why it becomes popular, and first off, let's address what absolutism is. Absolutism is when there is one individual who has complete power over the state. A state being a country like France or England at this period of time. So one particular individual has complete power. He has power over the military, he has political power, economic power. He can really decide which direction the country is going, and he's not going to be tackled or pulled down by an outside force. He has complete control, and that's going to be the main objective of many of these kings and politicians at this period of time. Now, prior to this point, we had kings and lords very much like the Middle Ages, and the kings shared their power with these lords. There was really a balancing act between both of these groups. Typically, think of the king as having absolute power, and so the first problem to tackle with is, well, why isn't the king in complete power? Well, during the Middle Ages, now this is of course going much before the 1600s, the king, he had land, and there really wasn't a stable currency because there was a lot of conflict going on during the Middle Ages. It was almost constant. People were competing with one another. They used force to compete with one another. So the king offered land up for loyalty, and they promised to fight with him. Now hopefully that loyalty would pan out, but sometimes it didn't. But eventually, through the courses of the Crusades, but also the Black Death that would happen in the 1400s, there was also the 100 Years' War, there was a lot of conflict, a lot of death, disease. Eventually, the king started gaining more and more power due to the depletion of population, but also the lack of powerful individuals with wealth. Now, the king started to gain more wealth by basically taxing and finding new ways to tax the population, including the lords. So eventually the king started gaining more and more power. So now we have a situation where the kings are rather powerful, and certainly more powerful than the lords, and way more powerful than the peasants of the day. So this is basically the crux where we start with the 1600s of moving into an absolutist state. Now, how this idea starts to develop is influenced by various different factors. So the question is, why does this happen now? Well, part of the reason is from 1618 to about 1648, there was a series of religious wars going on in Europe, and this generally affected France and the German states. We don't have one German country yet. That's going to happen much later. The European powers were very good at splitting up the Germanies, or the German states, as it were. The reason being is if they were united, they would actually be able to confront and maybe cause some problems for Britain, France, Austria, and various other powers around them. So these states ensured that Germany didn't become into being. Of course, that's going to happen much, much later, and we're going to see the consequences of that much later on. But this religious war is, in part, comes about with essentially Lutheranism. We have this guy, Martin Luther, who thought that the Roman Catholic Church was not conveying the message he thought needed to be conveyed. And so what you have is the schism of the Roman Catholic Church. And so you have the Protestant movement. And so you have Lutherans. Later on, you're going to have Calvinists. So you have this branch of Protestants, and then you have a branch of Catholics. And so by the 1600s, there's a series of religious wars lasting about 30 years. Generally, why we call this the 30 Years' War. And so they rampage all throughout France and the German states, causing a lot of, certainly, death through disease, poverty, warfare. And so this was definitely a bad situation for the Europeans. And this conflict didn't really seem to come to an end. This, of course, concerned a lot of people. Also, in the 1600s and around this time, science was becoming more predominant. And we're going to get to the scientific revolution later. But the beginnings of the scientific revolution and science overtaking religious thinking was starting to come about as well. And then in France, you had a civil war. You had England, there's a civil war, and in Spain, there's a rebellion. So you have a lot of countries fighting amongst themselves. You have rebellion, so these same countries are fighting with each other. So there's a lot of conflict, a lot of chaos, religious schisms, science is coming about, and many people feared that potentially God might be angry. And so there was talk of the second coming of Christ, Judgment Day, and all that good stuff. So many Europeans, and you can look at sources of this, actually thought the world was going to come to an end. So that provoked some thinkers to try and fix this problem. And so they came up with this idea of absolutism. So, one of these individuals is Thomas Hobbes. In his book, The Leviathan, which was produced in 1651, he proposes an idea to fix this disaster, as they called it. Basically, it was by his thinking that a ruler with absolute power would be able to fix the situation. Whenever there's a moment of chaos, there's, for example, a political disorder, a lot of social disorder, generally people align themselves with more radical political alignments. And we've seen this in history from time to time as well. For example, after World War I, you have the rise of Adolf Hitler and the fascist group, the Nazis. People were moved to go along with that political movement because basically life was so dire that why not? And we're definitely going to be looking at World War II, but take a look, for example, in the Middle East today and other periods of time. Whenever the economy is in poor condition, generally people move towards political movements that may not necessarily be generally popular in stable times. So in this case, they move away from the general political order of the day where the king shared his power, and now he is going to have complete and utter control over the country. That was a method to fix everything. So the idea was that people would surrender their freedoms and control to the ruler, the king in this case. The ruler would be able to make laws, enact the laws, legislate. You would be able to enforce these laws, and basically be able to maintain order in any way he saw fit. And the main purpose of this was to produce order, and everything was just cast aside. So you're not going to have, for example, the freedoms that we have today here in the United States with the Bill of Rights. You're not going to be able to write anything you want. You're not going to be able to say whatever you want, and nothing's going to happen to you. If somebody doesn't like it, the king, you're potentially going to be arrested. And that did happen in the coming centuries. So this was a political order that was popular at the time because of all the chaos going on. The ruler will be able to raise an army and beat off any sort of rebellious groups, and also be able to beat off any invading armies, creating order within the country. And also these new laws would hopefully be able to create order and stability and then stave off potentially the end of the world, as many of these Europeans were fearing at this time. So, Thomas Hobbes proposes this theory of absolutism. He's not going to be the only individual that is going to try this. There's another individual, a Frenchman. Jean Bodin is going to propose an idea very similar to Thomas Hobbes. Basically, they agreed on many points. They believe that the monarch should not share power. They believe that monarchs should make the laws themselves, enforce the laws. They believe that the monarchs were above the law, so they could not be arrested for violating their own laws. They should also follow God's law, meaning essentially the Ten Commandments. They believe that monarchs are still basically should adhere to those laws. They also believe that the monarch should respect the property of the citizens, but of course that's, as we're going to see, not always respected. Now, Jean Bodin, the Frenchman, he is going to believe that the monarchs got their power through God. They were basically ordained or chosen by God. Thomas Hobbes is going to disagree with that point, but that's essentially the only point that they disagree on. And you can kind of figure this out by the countries that they're from. Jean Bodin is from France. They're generally more religious, while Thomas Hobbes is from England, where they have more of a Protestant view, where typically they don't follow along with strict religious and chosen by God type of doctrine. So this is the theory of absolutism. Of course, the real question is, who puts this in practice and how does it go? So that I'll leave to the next video.